Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to today's session on reimbursing and monetizing digital health in APAC. So thanks a lot for joining us this morning in Singapore. And thanks to our speakers and moderator for the webinar today. So we will have Stephen Sunderland, Arathi Sasidharan, and Fabio Mola from L.E.K Consulting, and Shebnem Erdol from Abbott, Bourcet from Johnson & Johnson, and Julianna Yeung from Fresenius Medical Care. Next, please. So before we start, just a very simple instruction. If you have any question for the panelists, please submit it through the chat, and we will try to answer at the end of this webinar during the Q&A session. Next, please. So this webinar is part of the APACMed Digital Health Committee. We reached the 100 individual members last week, so I think it was a good way to kick off this session today to announce this. More than 30 companies, large multinational SMEs and startups with two objectives. One is to create and share knowledge around digital health, and the other is to advocate for regional policies that can ease and enable digital health in our region. So we are focusing on several areas of work, and one of them is reimbursement. So specifically, this project was conducted by L.E.K Consulting and the Digital Health Reimbursement Working Group. And the objective was, of course, to create knowledge, learning from how companies are managing to get their digital health solutions reimbursed in our region. So that said, I will give the floor to the L.E.K team to start this webinar. And again, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thanks, Roberta. Much appreciated. And thank you for the introduction. So as Roberta was just mentioning, we've been working with the APACMed team to really highlight some of the examples and draw out some of the learnings from the early entrance into the digital health space in APAC, and particularly what they've learned, or what can be learned from them around reimbursement and monetization issues, which are a key part of the go-to-market chain, as I'm sure everybody on this call will realize. So just to do a quick introduction to the two people who will be speaking at the top of this session. We have a little bit of content up at the front here that summarizes some of what's available via APACMed as an output of the project. So you'll hear two of us talking to some of that content. Myself, Stephen Sunderland, I'm a partner with L.E.K Consulting. I'm based in our practice in Shanghai. So I have the privilege of working from my office right now because we're not on lockdown. But I've been with the firm for a couple of decades. I've headed our medtech and digital health practice in China for the last 10 years or so. But originally, as you can probably tell from my accent, came out of the UK. Arathi, do you want to just give a brief introduction to yourself?
Sure, thanks, Steve, and good morning, everyone. My name is Arathi Sasidharan. I'm a principal with L.E.K Consulting in our life sciences practice. I work quite closely with Steve on our digital health work in the region. I'm based out of our Singapore office. I've been with L.E.K for over 7 years and in consulting for close to 10. So looking forward to this session. Back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Arathi. What I thought we'd do today is for maybe 20 minutes or so, give a quick recap of some of the key findings that we discovered as part of this project before cutting across to our panelists, who I'll ask to introduce themselves more completely at the start of the panel session in about 20 minutes or so. But before that, what I thought we could cover would be a little bit about who we are, just so you know who's talking to you, recap the approach that we followed for those of you who haven't been involved in the nitty-gritty of what we've been doing with the working group as part of APACMed. I'll pass to Arathi on some of the best practices and the key considerations, and then come back and moderate the panel, so you get a change of voice somewhere in here. So a little bit about L.E.K and the process we've been following. So healthcare, L.E.K, if you go on L.E.K.com, you'll see we're a generalist consulting firm, but actually healthcare is our largest practice. We've got established practices in all our offices around the world focused on healthcare. And we have our APAC Life Sciences Center of Excellence based out of Singapore. Actually, it's a collaboration with Singapore's EDB that anchors our practice in the region. The digital health space is a very broad one, and that's one of the challenges that we had in thinking about how to support APACMed and its members in driving something insightful about the space in Asia-Pac. Because as you can see on screen here, there's a really broad array of different applications, different use cases for which digital health is used and is well recognized, or increasingly well recognized. So from everything up at the top left-hand end of the page here around diagnosis, treatment, and monitoring at a distance, for example, through personalized decision-making, personalized medicine, patient engagement, through to more back-office type applications and use cases, for example, around efficiency gain, safety and quality, things that don't necessarily touch on patients directly, wouldn't be visible to a patient or necessarily even to a clinician. Data exchange and health records, and indeed on towards and up into sort of population health and health management, all of which is clearly very front of mind for government health bodies and population health management at the moment. So as we thought about where in that space we could make a dent in how to think about reimbursement in Asia Pacific, we work with a working group, about a dozen different organizations at various stages of digital maturity, of business maturity across the region, to try and find nuggets of information, nuggets of insight that could be helpful for understanding what would be useful for the broader membership. And of course, the challenges that digital health face in the region, and in any region, frankly, coming to market, have some commonalities. So in Asia Pacific in particular, the regulatory frameworks that apply to digital health are not necessarily that specific. They're not specific to digital health itself. They often get lumped in with other parts of medical technology approval. And that isn't necessarily appropriate. A lot of other jurisdictions, or some jurisdictions around the world, have gone to dedicated pathways for certain types of digital solution. There is, of course, stakeholder unfamiliarity with adopting new solutions. That's not a new thing for APACMed's members, of course. I mean, medical technology companies are bringing new and unfamiliar solutions to market every day. But oftentimes the digital nature, the remote nature, and the back end, essentially, the analytical aspects of a lot of digital health are just quite deeply unfamiliar to clinicians, to potential payers, and to other stakeholders across our health ecosystems. And they don't necessarily fit that neatly within existing care paradigms. So there's often changes to business processes, clinical pathways, the ways that clinicians and patients engage that are entailed by these digital solutions, that make uptake that much more challenging, or driving uptake that much more challenging. But a clear part of any go-to-market strategy is going to be the reimbursement pathway, so making these solutions affordable for patients, for consumers, ultimately, who may need them. And that has been really the focus of the specific work that we've been doing with APACMed during the last month. So the reimbursement work stream, which we have been supporting, the objective here has been to really create, find and detail successful cases of digital health reimbursement and monetization in APAC, with a view to extracting the key learnings and best practices that can then be used to help inform and support policymakers under influence, of course, from APACMed and its members, inform them on things that work well, things that are necessary to help digital health deliver the benefits to their patients, to their health systems that we know it can deliver. And of course, as we think about those successful case studies, we've actually, as befits the broad range of what's available in digital health already in Asia Pacific today, we followed a bit of a process to find those examples and align on those examples with the working group. So we really had 4 stages to the project, the first of which was really around mapping the universe, how to think about the digital health market, and then working through a prioritization of those companies, dozens and dozens of companies that and products that could be taken as successful digital health examples already. What we had to do was draw a line somewhere, so we looked at 15 specific products and companies as part of this process in a reasonable level of depth, and how that they had gone to market specifically in Asia Pacific. So, and with a definite bias and a deliberate bias, actually, not necessarily just on the startup landscape or the early stage landscape, which in Asia Pacific is of course very exciting, and there's a lot going on there. But because of the nature of what we were looking for, which is really learnings around reimbursement and monetization, we were looking for success stories. So we naturally gravitated to some more mature examples and companies and products to look at in the market. And we'll come back to some of those in a moment, and Arathi will talk us through some of the examples that we've got. And then as part of the closure process in the last couple of weeks, we've distilled out from those profiles of digital health to look at what are the specific best practices that are necessary for reimbursement and monetization across the region. So we looked across a pretty broad range, even whilst looking for those relatively more mature propositions who had gone through at least the monetization, commercialization process already in at least some part of the Asia Pacific region. So we looked at companies in the AI imaging space. Clearly that's really relatively well advanced in some parts of the region. Robotics, clearly we have a global champion in the form of Intuitive in there, but also looked at Toyota, who have an interesting proposition too. On the diagnostic side, clearly there's lots of interesting things coming through right now in terms of AI supported diagnostics that go above and beyond imaging. Similarly, remote monitoring. So we looked quite hard at Abbott, and it's great to have Shebnem on the line today, who will, I'm sure, talk a bit more about her experience and Abbott's experience in taking propositions to market, but also into other areas such as digital therapeutics, vitals monitoring, smart treatments, and neuromodulation. So we didn't want to focus, we deliberately didn't focus on one specific use case. We didn't specifically focus on any particular therapeutic area, because what we wanted to get to was a sense and a set of learnings that would be useful across the APACMed membership base, which we know is very diverse in terms of the types of products and the therapeutic areas that you work on. At this point, I'll throw across to my colleague Arathi, who will talk us through some of the framework we developed and some of the key findings that came out of some of that profiling work.
Thank you, Steve. Now, as Steve mentioned, we profiled about 15 digital health solutions that he just shared with us on the prior page. What we did was extract 9 best practices that we observed these companies to have followed in pursuing reimbursement and setting up their monetization approach in the region. 3 of these best practices are really no different to pursuing reimbursement for a medical device. Again, this is unsurprising. It's, considering most solutions, digital health solutions, are currently reviewed under frameworks that have been set up for medical devices. So when it comes to navigating the local reimbursement landscape, and investing in HTA and cost effectiveness studies, showcasing superior evidence, it really does draw on core capabilities that already sit quite squarely within MedTech and this group here. There are, however, a few other best practices that we observed that we'd like to highlight as well in a digital health solution successfully pursuing reimbursement and monetization in the region. We'll go through each of these one by one and share with you examples of actions companies have taken. This is not meant to be comprehensive, but our intention through these examples is to really illustrate what's being done today, what actions are possible while these markets continue to develop in their understanding, acceptance, and adoption of digital health. So with that, let's go to the first set of best practices, which really draw on those core MedTech capabilities. The first is, of course, having a thorough understanding of what the local reimbursement requirements are. And this includes any additional practical steps that could be taken to increase the likelihood of gaining reimbursement. So as an example here, if you take Abbott's Freestyle Libre, they are reimbursed in Australia, fully subsidized for eligible citizens as of March earlier this year. And in Australia, Abbott conducted randomized clinical trials, which is not listed or explicitly as a requirement, but helped strengthen their application for reimbursement and then subsequently gaining listing on MBS. The second best practice around investing in HTA and cost effectiveness studies to really demonstrate the value that these products bring and help justify product pricing to payers. Here, what we have observed companies who have done is a combination of both studies done in the region as well as leveraging study results from elsewhere. So if you take Intuitive Surgical, for example, they've conducted a number of cost effectiveness studies in Japan to demonstrate the cost savings by shortening duration of hospital stays. But you also see companies that have leveraged studies from the US or UK, Merlin at Home, for example, leveraged their US study to demonstrate cost reduction opportunities in studies of ICDs and pacemakers with remote monitoring. So we really have seen a combination of both and not purely studies conducted in the region. The third best practice around generating superior clinical evidence here, much like any medical device, any new solution, digital health solution coming into the market needs to demonstrate the value delivered relative to the standard of care. Here, again, across companies, we've seen various types of studies delivered, again, depending on the nature of the product. You have heart flow analysis, for example, that showcase that non-invasive analysis can provide greater accuracy in determining arterial blockages. You have companies like L.E.K that can help doctors diagnose patients in a shorter period of time. And other solutions that have also showcased improved outcomes for patients. So again, number of best practices here. The ones that we highlight on this page are really those that are well familiar with the APACMed group and really draw on capabilities already sitting in medical devices and that translate over quite directly to the digital health space as well. But there are other best practices that we observed as well. Moving on to the next set. The first is around market creation and driving acceptance for digital health products. Now, going into this, there needs to be a recognition that this is a multi-year effort. If you take LivaNova's VNS therapy system, for example, in Australia, they had to commit resources to provide 2 years of health economics and clinical data. So it is a rigorous, costly process. On the other hand, you have Intuitive Surgical that continued to make investments in Japan and market shaping through clinical studies, which led to reimbursement of selected procedures after 10 years. So you see a full spectrum in terms of time frame and investment that needs to go behind the market creation effort, which ultimately will depend on the nature of the product. Another best practice that we have observed is around the reimbursement codes that are targeted. We've seen companies quite successfully target existing reimbursement codes. For example, B-Bronze space pumps in Korea, in Thailand are currently reimbursed at the same rates as the conventional pumps. There's no distinction made. But they're also concurrently working, say in Korea, they're concurrently working with HIRA and the Ministry of Health and Welfare to get separate reimbursement codes. Intuitive was able to bypass some of the difficulties in securing new reimbursement codes by working with existing, say, procedural codes for laparoscopic procedures. So, we highlight these as actions that companies can take in the interim, while the broader digital health landscape, the codes, the frameworks in the country really develop and take those next steps forward. These are actions that can be done in the short to medium term. There's also an element of targeting advocates for you and really going after those that can be digital champions. This links a little to the point Steve made earlier around building familiarity with where these products and digital health solutions fit in the care paradigm. And here's where you have patients or professional advocacy organizations that can help on that dimension. So for example, Diabetes Australia has helped to drive reimbursement coverage in Australia for Freestyle Libre, Abbott's Freestyle Libre. In Japan, we have the example of HeartFlow that gathered support from professors and KOLs in teaching universities. They targeted the Japan Association of Cardiovascular Intervention and Therapeutics. So there are a number of different types of stakeholders that can be targeted as advocates for your product. Even public health agencies in India, for example, UE Life Sciences for their IBREST exam worked very closely with the Indian public health agencies to facilitate large-scale implementation of the product and really drive that advocacy in India. So you see a full spectrum from patient associations to professional advocacies to KOLs and academics, teaching institutions to help rally support and make your case, support your case for reimbursement when you approach payers. Moving on to the last set of best practices. Now, with digital comes data, of course, and any partnership that can offer access to large data sets are indeed valuable. Take the example of Infovision. They partnered with some of the largest 3A hospitals in China, resulting in access to the largest medical training database in the world. Extremely valuable for them for their product. In Singapore, what we've observed for Selena Plus, Iris partnered with Singapore Optometric Association to get access to their network of 23 optometric practices. So here again, this is, as I mentioned earlier, it's not meant to be comprehensive, but you can see the different types of partnerships that companies have pursued to support the solution, to support the outcomes of the evidence that it can help generate through more data, through partnerships as well. Now, while a number of these best practices have been discussed in the context of pursuing public health reimbursement, we also want to acknowledge and highlight that there are other alternative paths to target as well. You have the private insurer. Take NeuroTrack, for example. They worked with in Japan with large private insurers, Daiichi Life, Sompo Himawari, to roll out their NeuroTrack cognitive assessments. Beyond private insurers, There are also other funds that companies could potentially look at. So for example, there could be disease-specific funds, say Diabetes Australia, or there could be funds that cover home-based care, where the inclusion of a digital health solution and coverage for it may be possible. So again, as we think about reimbursement for digital health solutions in the region, it does go beyond the public payer as well. We have to look at other opportunities in the market. Now, as we went about looking at the different actions, the different steps these companies have taken to pursue reimbursement, we also took a look at the monetization model that they have followed. And here, again, you see a number of different models used. And Steve, if you don't mind going to the next page, I think it can help illustrate that a bit better. But really, depending on the nature of the product, you see everything from pay-per-use to a leasing model to device sale plus consumables or subscription-based models. As Steve mentioned earlier, we have a very broad spectrum of products and use cases when we think about digital health and everything that sits under that umbrella. And clearly, the monetization model that's used also needs to consider the unique nature of that product. But interestingly, what we've also observed in the region are companies evolving that monetization model over time. Here, take the case of Toyota with their WellWalk robotic system. When it was the first version that was made available, it was monetized on a leasing basis, but subsequently, the second version was made available for purchase with a monthly maintenance fee included in it. Take the example of Butterfly's ultrasound IQ device based on an upfront plus subscription fee model. But they also evolved the monetization model to include an enterprise business model, which then helps them provide greater integration capabilities and support to customers. So again, there are a number of different considerations here, especially considering the large number of use cases that sit within digital health. Now, as I mentioned, there are different best practices that to consider as you pursue reimbursement and you think about monetization in the region. As we went through this process, one of the key questions that came up as we worked with the working group as well was, which markets in the region do you consider? Right? Where do you go first? Yes, these are actions to take, but in which markets should I try to apply these best practices and target with my solution? Now, as we'll see on the next page, what we've observed as markets in the region where there appears to be the most promising track record for digital health reimbursement fall currently across Japan, Korea, Australia, Taiwan, and selected provinces in mainland China. Here's where we've observed the highest number of digital health solutions and reimbursement for them. So again, recognizing that the entire region is continuing to develop, we're still in early stages with some markets slightly more advanced. These are potentially markets that may present with a higher likelihood of reimbursement success in the near term. So hopefully with that, we've given you a few points to ponder as you think about reimbursement for digital health solutions in the region. Let me hand it back to Steve to close the discussion on some key considerations for the group as you think of next steps for your own digital health solutions. Back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Arathi. Yeah, so I think as we thought about this from the perspective of you as members of APACMed bringing digital health solutions to market in the region, I think there are a few things that sprang to mind for us as relevant questions for consideration, which are captured on the page in front of you now. So first and foremost, as Arathi was just saying, well, which are the markets that are actually best suited for that solution? Where should you really start? And oftentimes, whilst that might be a direct relation to where you can get a pathway to rapid reimbursement, it may be that actually that's not the only consideration. And figuring out where the commercial potential, where the clinical need is greatest, and where the stakeholder support can be navigated most easily may well lead you to a different solution than just simply where reimbursement takes you first. Clearly understanding the nature of the registration reimbursement frameworks that are relevant for digital health solutions is going to be critical, particularly for a lot of the people in the roles they're in on this call today, but also for the wider internal stakeholder groups within your firms. And identifying which of those hurdles in the go-to-market pathway are actually going to be the most challenging to cross and figure out how you will address those is clearly an important part of that. What's the right strategy to navigate all of that? How can you actually do that fast across the region? Clearly, the digital solution space itself is moving very fast. What is the art of the possible from a digital health delivery perspective is moving generally faster than regulatory systems or indeed commercialization systems can manage to keep up with. So really, how do you build pace into that drumbeat, into that approval process across the region? What's the right monetization mechanisms, both before and after reimbursement? You saw some examples in there from Arathi around companies who'd actually deliberately changed their monetization approach partway down their commercialization pathway in order to make sure that that met the needs of their key stakeholders, of the key payers who were actually benefiting from their solution and who needed to be able to sign the check for it. Ultimately, where are the partnerships that you can forge to build that pace into the go-to-market approach? And then what market shaping activities are you going to need to undertake? Whether that's on the sort of policy influence side up at the very front end, or indeed further down the pathway in terms of making sure that stakeholders really understand and can benefit from the solutions that you're bringing to market, and which of those activities really deliver good ROI versus just being potentially relics of a medtech centric, of a previous legacy approach that isn't truly driving what you need to out of a digital space. We'll pause there, take a breath, and flip to the panel discussion. So we're just over the half-hour mark, just to orient our panelists. Maybe panelists, if I could ask you to come off mute, start your video. I'll stop screen sharing so the attendees can actually see you properly, and ask you to introduce yourselves in just a moment. May I also remind attendees that if you have specific questions that you'd either like to pose to our panelists or would like to be picked up after the event, please do submit them through the chat. The APACMed team is monitoring that. You may get some of them answered today, you may get some of them answered in due course, but we'd love to hear them. So in terms of our esteemed panel today, we've got four people from across the industry. So Bourcet of Johnson & Johnson, Shebnem Erdol of Abbott, as well as Julianna Yeung of Fresenius Medical Care, and my colleague Fabio Mola, who's head of sector based out of Singapore. Maybe in that order, could I ask you panelists to introduce yourselves and just give a short introduction to your role and maybe even your role in the project as well.
Hello, everyone. So Anne Bourcet here. So I am humbled and honored to be chair of the APACMed Digital Health Reimbursement Work Group. So I'm really thankful and it really appreciative of all the active members and partners who have really worked in this reimbursement work group. And we have already delivered on some groundworks, such as this report and webinar, and all under the leadership of Roberta. Thank you very much. So in my, let's say, day work, I am part of Johnson & Johnson Medical Asia Pacific, and I'm the director for Health Economics and Market Access, responsible for the orthopedics business. In that, digital surgery, as you know, for Johnson & Johnson, is really a high priority as we are striving to enhance the surgical experience and patient outcomes. About a little bit about myself. So I have now more than 10 years of healthcare industry experience, spanning across pharma and medical devices in medical affairs, as well as health economics and market access. So I'm really passionate about patient access to innovation, articulating the right evidence with the right value for value-based healthcare. So thank you very much for inviting me to this panel discussion.
Thanks, Anna. Shebnem, do you want to go next?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Shebnem Erdol. I'm heading up Market Access, Health Economics and Reimbursement function of Abbott Medical Devices for Australia and New Zealand. I've been in medtech industry over 10 years now across different geographies, including Europe, Central Asia, and worked across different portfolios such as minimally invasive therapies, cardiovascular, diabetes, and neuromodulation. Some of these portfolios have focused on implantable technologies with app components. And this is why I have been involved in this exciting project and looking forward to sharing my experience and exchanging views. Thank you.
Thanks, Shebnem. Julianna, do you want to go next?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to be a panelist on here. I'm Julianna Yeung, and I'm leading the Health Economics and Market Access function within Fresenius Medical Care Asia Pacific. We are quite a unique company where we're a dialysis manufacturer as well as a service provider. So in terms of the digital health solution, we are faced with quite unique challenges because we also have a patient pool that we have provide direct care with. And this is why I'm part of the digital health committee within APACMed. And as for myself, I've also been in the industry for over a decade, spanning from R&D, medical affairs, and now to health economics. And so very excited about a lot of these movements lately in digital health. And I think this is what's going to transform healthcare in the future. So very glad to be part of this group of very intelligent individuals, and looking forward to the discussion that we'll have today.
Thanks, Julianna. Fabio, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to be a finalist. I'm a partner in L.E.K, been with L.E.K for 10 years now, based in Singapore for the last 6, and worked on a few medical device and digital solutions, monetization projects, and go-to-market projects. So happy to lend that expertise in, during the panel chat.
Thanks very much. So, of course, we have some prepared questions whilst we wait for the audience to whet their appetites on specifics that they'd like to know about. Maybe, Shebnem, if I come to you first, because you've had some good experience bringing product to market already in Asia Pac. Maybe could you share some of your experience in getting to reimbursement essentially in the region?
Sure, thank you. I think firstly having a clear health economic value proposition substantiated through the evidence for the market in question, understanding the budget holder's perspective, whether it be a patient or a consumer as a direct payer, hospital or a small clinic. It may also be a state or a federal agency or a private insurer. It really needs to address a current or a potential unmet clinical need or an administrative need. So understanding the general ecosystem and the payers' motivations are, I think, key aspects that leads to success. If we zoom in on the example from Australia, the formal reimbursement pathway perspective, the technology with an app component are evaluated in the same way as medical devices. The software alone without attachment to an implantable device is not subject to the traditional reimbursement scheme. So in our case, in our products, we knew the pathway, we knew the reimbursement framework and the requirements. The product has gone through the formal structured HTA evaluation process. It actually built on the previously conducted HTA process through Medicare Benefits, Medicare Services Advisory Committee. And we proceeded to the prosthesis list process. These are all obviously requiring health economic evidence. Additionally, in Australia, there are state and federal funding schemes accelerating commercialization grants to foster domestic innovation, as well as to export those innovations to the global markets. So some of the governments in Australia, state governments had new technology evaluation programs that provides funding to the hospitals for piloting new technologies. Similar programs or schemes might be available in some other countries in APAC as well. So this is something to consider. Lastly, if you're operating in an environment without any pathway, which is very likely to be the case in APAC, payer engagement will be the key, at least to initiate a dialogue and consideration by the policymakers. This is especially a key component, I think, if we consider that the healthcare industry is actually lagging other industries in digitization efforts. So continuous payer and regulator engagement overall is really crucial for success in commercialization. From our experience, this is what we have been observing.
That's a great tip. I think as we've observed over the last 6 months, I guess there's maybe less so on the digital medtech front, but certainly the regulatory leeway that's being afforded to telemedicine, for example, as a result of COVID is quite interesting in terms of how that's moving a lot of the industry forward. Maybe we can turn to some cautionary tales. That's clearly a lot of learnings that you've had already out of that from sort of Abbott and Australia particularly perspective. Julianna, I think you have some cautionary tales to bring as well, right?
Sure. Because for my company, we are involved in quite a big range of digital health solutions. And I think finding the right outcomes for each of those technology to demonstrate value is quite a challenge. And I think actually developing the technology itself isn't the hardest part. I think the hardest part is actually finding the true unmet need of each of the healthcare systems. And like what Shebnem was saying, like those dialogues with your payers really depends on whether that unmet need is really quantifiable and whether that digital health product is really meeting that unmet need. And I think this really will determine whether the success of your digital health will be there in the future. I think that's one cautionary tale, because I see some of the digital health products where it's kind of a nice to have instead of really bridging that unmet need gap that the particular healthcare system has. And I think the second one is there may be expectation both on the purchaser and on the provider side to actually provide these digital health technology for free or for very minimal price or cost in order to quote unquote rush to the market. Because some of these technologies, you do need real world evidence in order to prove their cost effectiveness or their value to the healthcare system. And I think that's where there will be a balance between at the point of before you get reimbursement, how long are you able to sustain providing that digital health product for free until you reach the point where you get to reimbursement? And after reimbursement, would there be expectations still from the purchaser side for you to continue to provide that solution for free or for very minimal added cost. So I think those are some of the two real cautionary tales that I would really bring up. One is quantifying the real unmet need of the healthcare system, and also expectation from the purchaser, from the payer, and also from the provider. Like, how much are you willing to invest or also pay for the digital health technology?
Yeah, digital
And
health
Steve,
is one of those unusual areas where the first patient served might cost you $1 million, but the second one might be effectively free. So the marginal cost goes down quite rapidly, potentially. But no, that's how to navigate those economics with payers and manage their expectations that's a very tough call. Sorry,
Steve, if I can add something. Yeah, so very, very quickly, I think one of the things is that I've seen is also don't treat the payer system in the healthcare system as monolithic, meaning try to look at the incentives that exist within the healthcare system. Because as an example, right, if an hospital is penalized for re-hospitalizing certain kind of patients within a certain amount of time, then they have an incentive to pay for a solution that helps with that. But if they're not, for example, then that solution doesn't necessarily matter to them, because actually re-hospitalizing, for example, brings in money. So I think that don't treat the healthcare system as monolithic. See what the incentives are within each of the steps, because that reducing some of that friction actually creates values in places where you didn't think value was there.
Thanks, Fabio. Very valuable point. Shebnem, did you want to add anything?
I think just to build on what my colleagues have mentioned, I think we sometimes assume that the payers, the budget holders or regulators will receive the message, the value proposition right away, which may not be the case. You know, they may interpret the new technology as a disruption and a challenging scenario, which is I think, significant caution. We should be really able to clearly articulate and demonstrate the opportunity through this disruption. And also, I think the digital health technologies can be fairly sophisticated. We may be using a different terminology. So it's really important to have a clear explanation to be able to educate stakeholders and ensure that they're on the same page with us.
Thanks, Shebnem. Valuable point. Yeah. Maybe we'll switch gears a little. So Arathi took us through 9 best practices earlier on in this webinar. Maybe as chair of the working group, and you could talk us through your perspective on which of those is most or least important and why.
Yeah, well, I think that actually in the 9 reimbursement best practices, you might have noticed that the I is actually repeated several times. So I think that probably which one I would choose might be the invest. And why is that? It's really really what Julianna had just explained. It's really the balance between rush to market and then being able to build a sustainable access model. And true innovation, as we know, is going to transform clinical practice. But in order for that, you need to build on that adoption process. And that often requires change management, change into the clinical practice to enable that positioning of that new digital solution in the workflow, how the patients would behave and manage through that new workflow would really need maybe hospital management change or even societal changes. If, for example, you have a new surgical paradigm that will really change the way patients are managed. So I think that really building on experience and evidence, taking that time to build that sustainable access model would really ensure a higher impact on how that digital solution will really transform healthcare. And demonstrate the value of these technologies. And once you have that experience and evidence, I think then it is, let's say, a much easier dialogue with the payers that Shebnem has really rightly highlighted the importance to have that, engage in that dialogue to secure their willingness to pay in the long term. And with the reimbursement, we can really look at broadening the patient access as you ensure that more patients can benefit from that innovation. One example is really the Davinci Robots with intuitive surgical. You can see in the report that after its reimbursement in 2013, the number of sales have tripled just the year after the reimbursement. So it really highlights the necessity for us to build partnerships with hospitals, clinics, practitioners, physicians, surgeons, to engage and build that experience and generate that evidence to demonstrate the value of digital health technologies.
Sure. That's helpful. I guess maybe one follow-up question. If investment is the hardest or the most important piece of this, then what does that say about the opportunities for startups in the region? Because maybe that's one of the key challenges for them is securing the funding.
Yes, no, absolutely. And that will take time. Reimbursement and that dialogue takes time for us to build. And we have seen in the presentation that there are other mechanisms or pathways that we can consider to first engage with that adoption process to for example, get that partnership with some of the insurers, so private insurers, or hospitals, clinics would be willing to use the digital technology, build that experience, generate that evidence, as well as be your strong advocates to be able to highlight what is the medical and clinical need that we are addressing, and then you have a much stronger value proposition when you engage with your discussion with the payers.
Thanks for that. Maybe one for Fabio here. You mentioned that you supported clients across the region essentially in taking digital propositions to market. Do you have any observations on which markets and why? How to prioritize markets as we bring new solutions to patients?
Yeah, so I think the easy markets to prioritize are the ones that we've shown on the slides in terms of availability of reimbursement. They already have at least some form of framework. They, given their past experience, they understand the value of some of these solutions. I think that there is a couple of questions that are interesting in the among the attendees that's probably worth answering. And one is around which approach works best on, on approaching the regulator, which is the gains in value versus cost. And I think that that's actually one of the ways to look at the markets and how to prioritize them. Clearly, markets that value the value part of the equation are the ones that I would prioritize first, simply because they will speed up your solution and they will probably reimburse it faster than other markets where budget is the primary consideration and cost avoidance is the primary consideration. And that's simply because a lot of these markets that have cost avoidance as the first priority do have multiple competing priorities. So digital health isn't their first priority. There is a lot of different areas where they're engaged in, from chronic diseases to oncology that require the same level of attention, if not higher, in their eyes. And so that's probably one of the lenses that I would look at when thinking about prioritizing markets. The second thing that is interesting is whether you should look at emerging markets or not. There are companies that even in classic medical devices have invested a lot in market shaping and in market work with different authorities to get their devices approved. And I wouldn't overlook places like Thailand, for example, where the system is evolved enough that there is a fair amount of both doctors that are willing to try new solutions, but also potentially budget, at least in some parts of the insurance system, to pay for solutions. The other part that I wouldn't overlook is countries where there is a fair amount of private insurance and private pay. So as Anne was saying, don't be afraid to work with private insurance at the beginning, or private payers to get your solution accepted, especially if you're a startup. I think there is a lot of mileage to be had by having the solution trialed in country and then bring that evidence to payers.
Thanks, Fabio. And I guess one quick follow-up question, and I must ask you to be brief given the time on the clock now. Julianna raised the very valid point around changing monetization models, or the challenge of getting to scale quickly, getting data, getting real-world evidence, then shifting to value maximization later on. Do you have any tips or thoughts on that?
Again, a couple of things. One is the point that I made before around the system incentives. Don't overlook the fact that different points of the system may have different incentives, and therefore there may be places where your digital solution really creates some value, either in gains or cost avoidance. And the second point is don't be afraid of working with the private sector in the first place. Because I do think that there is power to pay in Asia in general, especially in countries where the system is mixed, where you have public and private. And that allows you some runway in building the evidence they need to go to payers.
Okay, that's great. I think that brings us to close to time, but maybe just one further question I'll pose to maybe a couple of our panelists, just and asking you to be brief. The question is, what can attendees on this call, what would you advise them to do to be able to move fast, to bring product to market, digital health product to market? And maybe if I start there with Julianna and ask Anne to close, maybe.
Okay, sure. I think actually within the L.E.K report, it mentioned it several times. I think finding the right partner that can really, basically, you need someone to be a cheerleader for you instead of you being the cheerleader of your own product. And I think finding a credible partner, I generally think the physician societies are the best to partner with, because they are the best cheerleader for your solution. And they're the ones that really will be able to understand, like what Fabio was saying, like where the incentive drivers are. And I think that will be, I would say that will be the most important thing.
That's a clear tip. Thank you, Julianna.
Yeah, so I would just build on this, especially for the COVID-19 crisis has actually accelerated, as we have seen, some of the considerations by policymakers and payers on the value of digital health. We have seen a tremendous acceleration around regulatory, but also reimbursement willingness from these payers, especially for telemedicine. But we know that it's not enough, and it's only a very small part of digital health and how these technologies can really transform healthcare delivery in a more efficient, better quality, and more equitable access. So I think that these last months have shown us that there is maybe a better acceptance and appreciation of digital health and the value that it can bring. from policymakers, payers, but also providers and physicians who have maybe been a little bit cautious about its adoption, but with these changes and evolving environment, it is a great opportunity where these key stakeholders and partners are more willing to listen to what digital health can bring in terms of value to their work and for the patients. So I think that's also a great opportunity to engage more actively and maybe a little bit more willingness from these stakeholders to consider the adoption of digital health.
I think that's a great message to close on, actually. And the door is open. We kind of need to push on it a little bit to make sure that these solutions can get to market pretty quickly. I think there is a pretty, nobody would have wished for COVID, but it is an amazing opportunity to demonstrate the value of some of the solutions that are sort of technically achievable now. So I know we've hit some of the attendees' questions on the way through, so thank you to my panelists for reading along and hitting some of those as we go through. For those that are not, they are noted, and we'll try and revert to you directly on some of those questions in the coming days. Just before I hand back to Roberta, maybe just to say thank you to the panelists and thank you to everybody for making time to join this morning.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, and yeah, let me thank as well all the panelists and you, Stephen, for moderating this discussion. Also, thank you so much for all the work behind this webinar. And again, this is just the first step for our digital health reimbursement working group. A very interesting work. Our next project will be actually to support in the creation of a reimbursement framework for digital health in APAC. So it's something that we will kick off very shortly. I invite all the attendees to follow us on LinkedIn because we will be sharing more updates on the work of the Digital Health Committee and specifically from the reimbursement working group in the next weeks. So again, thank you very much. Have a great day and see you soon. Bye.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.